You are looking at a skull right now. Not yours, obviously, but one sitting behind glass in a museum somewhere in London or Paris or Berlin. The forehead slopes backward at an angle that looks wrong to your modern eye. The brow ridge juts forward like a stone ledge, thick enough to cast a shadow over the eye sockets. The jaw is massive, chinless, built for a kind of raw mechanical force your face has never needed to generate. And your first instinct, the one the museum placard practically trains into you, is that you are staring at something primitive, something that lost the evolutionary contest, something that disappeared from the earth because it simply was not equipped to survive alongside your ancestors. That instinct is wrong, and the specific way it is wrong reveals something genuinely uncomfortable about the species that actually made it through. Neanderthals did not fail. They lived across Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years. To put that number in proportion, anatomically modern Homo sapiens has existed for roughly the same stretch of time, but everything you would recognize as civilization, writing, agriculture, cities, laws, the concept of a weekend, all of it occupies the last 4% of that window. If you're enjoying this so far, hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I actually read them. Neanderthals survived ice ages that buried northern Europe under glaciers 2 kilometers thick. They hunted woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses with handheld thrusting spears, which means they closed to within arm's reach of animals that could crush a rib cage with a single movement before driving sharpened stone into them. Thomas Berger and Eric Trinkhaus published an analysis in 1995 comparing Neanderthal skeletal trauma patterns to those of modern humans engaged in various high-risk activities. The closest statistical match was professional rodeo riders, broken ribs, fractured skulls, healed forearm injuries consistent with close-range combat against massive, violently resisting prey. Neanderthals absorbed this kind of punishment as a matter of routine, healed, and went back out to do it again. For 300,000 years. Across multiple ice ages, across an entire continent, they buried their dead. At multiple sites across Europe and the Near East, Neanderthal remains have been found placed in deliberate positions within shallow pits, sometimes associated with objects or arrangements that suggest intent beyond simple disposal. At a site in Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France, researchers led by Jacques Joubert reported in 2016 that Neanderthals had constructed circular structures from broken stalagmites deep inside the cave, roughly 176,000 years ago. The structures showed evidence of fire use. There was no practical survival reason to go that deep into a cave and build something. Whatever they were doing in Bruniquel, it was not about food or shelter. It was about something else. Something we do not have a word for in the context of a species we have already decided was incapable of abstraction. In 2018, a study led by Dirk Hoffman used uranium-thorium dating to confirm that cave paintings in 3 Spanish caves, including hand stencils and geometric shapes in La Pasiega, were at least 64,000 years old. That predates the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by more than 20,000 years. Neanderthals made art. Or at the very least, they made marks on walls deep inside caves that look, by every available standard of analysis, like art. They manufactured adhesive from birch bark using dry distillation, a process that requires maintaining temperatures within a narrow and specific range for an extended period without any means of measurement. Try replicating that with raw materials and no instruments, and you will quickly appreciate what it implies about their planning, patience, and problem-solving capacity. They cared for their sick and injured over extended periods. A skeleton excavated by Ralph Selecki at Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, beginning in 1957, belonged to a male who had survived for years with a crushed left eye socket that almost certainly blinded him on that side, a withered right arm that had been lost or amputated below the elbow, significant damage to his right leg and foot, and evidence of healed cranial trauma. This individual could not have hunted, he could not have defended himself or traveled quickly. Somebody fed him, somebody protected him, somebody chose to keep him alive when the cold, simple calculus of survival in an ice age said to leave him behind. For years. And then, roughly 40,000 years ago, they vanished. Every last population, across every corner of their range. The species that had endured 300 millennia of glaciation, megafauna, and brutal close-quarters predation simply ceased to exist, leaving behind bones, stone tools, a few smears of pigment on cave walls, and a handful of genetic sequences embedded in your own chromosomes that you carry around without knowing it. The question most people ask is why they went extinct. But underneath that obvious question sits a stranger one, a more disturbing one, and one that tells you considerably more about yourself than about them. What would the world actually look like right now if they had not? The first thing we need to dismantle is the image most people carry: the caveman. The hunched, grunting, club-dragging brute stumbling through a world he cannot understand. That image traces back to one skeleton and one scientist who committed one of the most consequential misreadings in the history of paleontology. In 1908, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was pulled from a burial site at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in the Corrèze department of southern France. The French paleontologist Marcelin Boule spent years studying the remains and reconstructed the individual as slouching dramatically forward, bow-legged, with the head thrust out on a curved, ape-like spine. He described the species in terms that placed them closer to the great apes than to modern humans. The scientific community accepted his reconstruction. Popular culture absorbed it wholesale. For the better part of a century, every cartoon, every museum diorama, every textbook illustration depicted Neanderthals as stooped, dim, shambling creatures whose extinction was basically self-explanatory. The problem was that the La Chapelle skeleton belonged to an elderly male suffering from advanced osteoarthritis. His spinal curvature was degenerative joint disease. His abnormal gait was pathology, not species anatomy. Boule had examined one arthritic old man and concluded that his medical conditions were the defining physical traits of an entire lineage. In 1957, anatomists William Strauss and A.J.E. Cave published a re-examination of the La Chapelle skeleton in the Quarterly Review of Biology. Their conclusion has become one of the most quoted sentences in the field. Give a Neanderthal a bath, a shave, and a hat, put him on the New York City subway, and the other passengers would not give him a second glance. Neanderthals walked fully upright. Their posture was functionally identical to yours. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than modern human brains. Not smaller, larger. The modern Homo sapiens' cranial capacity averages roughly 1,350 cubic centimeters. Neanderthal skulls routinely measured between 1,400 and 1,500. The internal geometry was different, elongated from front to back, wider at the rear, with an especially pronounced occipital region, the zone that handles visual processing. Eileen Pierce and colleagues at Oxford published work in 2013 proposing that Neanderthals devoted a greater proportion of brain volume to visual processing than we do. They evolved across Europe, under overcast skies, in dense forest and scrubland, through ice ages when winter daylight in northern latitudes lasted only a handful of hours. Exceptional low-light visual acuity in cluttered, shadowed environments would have been an enormous survival advantage. So the picture shifts. You are not looking at a rough draft of a human being. You are looking at a finished alternative, a parallel solution to the same problem your ancestors were solving in equatorial Africa. How do you build a mind that keeps you alive when the world around you is unforgiving and constantly changing? The genetic evidence moves all of this from abstract paleontology into your own bloodstream. In 2010, Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig published a draft Neanderthal genome. The finding that remade the field overnight was straightforward, and it remade everything. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, not once, not as some vanishingly rare accident, repeatedly, across thousands of years, at multiple points of geographic contact in the Middle East and Europe. If you trace your ancestry to anywhere outside sub-Saharan Africa, between 1 and 4% of your genome is Neanderthal in origin. You, specifically, the person reading this sentence right now, carry DNA inherited from a species the Western scientific establishment spent over 100 years dismissing as subhuman. And that inherited material is not sitting passively in your cells like some fossilized souvenir. It is active. It is functional. It is shaping your biology right now. Michael Dannemann and Janet Kelso, also at Max Planck, published research in 2016 demonstrating that Neanderthal-derived gene variants actively influence the human immune system, specifically toll-like receptor genes, the molecular sentinels that detect and respond to invading bacteria and fungi. Other inherited variants affect keratin production in skin and hair cells. Others shape lipid metabolism and fat storage patterns. In 2020, Hugo Zeeberg and Svante Pabo published a paper in Current Biology identifying a Neanderthal-derived variant in the SCN9A gene, a voltage-gated sodium channel gene directly involved in the transmission of pain signals. Carriers of this variant, a measurable percentage of people with European ancestry, experience heightened sensitivity to physical pain. Part of how you register a burn or a bruise may descend directly from a Neanderthal who survived the frozen forests of Ice Age Europe 50,000 years ago and passed that heightened warning system on to descendants who eventually became you. The boundary between us and them is not a wall or a ditch or even a fence. It is a gradient, a slow fade, and that fade asks a question that no existing legal, moral, or philosophical system was designed to handle. If Neanderthals had survived, if a population had held on in the limestone gorges of southern Spain or the sheltered valleys of the Caucasus Mountains, protected by geography from the demographic tide of expanding Homo sapiens bands, would we have called them human? Would we have extended them rights, citizenship, personhood, the vote? Or would we have done to them what our species has done, with extraordinary consistency and institutional sophistication, to every population it has ever decided was different enough to exclude? If this is making you think, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. This channel only exists because of the people who share these videos, and I don't take that lightly. You do not need to imagine the answer. History already supplied it. When European colonial powers encountered indigenous peoples across the Americas, in Australia, across Africa and the Pacific, they did not perceive fellow humans. They perceived raw material. They constructed legal codes, theological doctrines, and scientific taxonomies to formalize that perception and render it permanent. The Australian government classified Aboriginal Australians under flora and fauna provisions until 1967. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist who designed the system of biological naming, still printed in every biology textbook on the planet, divided Homo sapiens into racial subcategories with assigned moral and behavioral characteristics in the 1735 first edition of Systema Naturae. Ota Benga, a Mbuti man from the Congo, was exhibited in the Monkey House of the Bronx Zoo in New York City in 1906. Paying visitors watched him through bars. Newspaper editorials debated whether the exhibit was appropriate. The zoo kept it open. These were not fringe episodes or aberrations. They were institutional, public, and considered reasonable by the societies that produced them. Now place a surviving Neanderthal population into that historical machinery, a group that is visibly, anatomically, measurably distinct from Homo sapiens. Shorter, wider, barrel-chested with a rib cage shaped like a bell, heavy brow ridges over deep-set eyes, a protruding midface, no chin, a body built on proportions that your brain would register as almost human and somehow, disturbingly, not. Skeletal muscle attachment analysis tells us that a male Neanderthal, pound for pound, was substantially stronger than any modern human. They could interbreed with Homo sapiens and produce fertile offspring. That exact combination, visible physical difference layered on top of demonstrated biological compatibility, is the formula that has generated the most catastrophic moral failures in the record of human civilization. Slavery rationalized through species classification, forced breeding programs concealed beneath scientific language, extermination campaigns marketed to the public as necessary hygiene. Peter Singer, the philosopher at Princeton who has spent decades examining moral reasoning across species boundaries, describes what he calls the expanding moral circle, the long, violent, agonizingly slow process by which human societies have gradually extended basic moral consideration to groups they previously treated as objects: women, enslaved populations, children, animals, to an incomplete and inconsistent degree. Every expansion of that circle has been fought with legal challenges, religious authority, and physical violence at every step. A surviving Neanderthal population would stress test the circle in ways nothing in human experience ever has. Are they people? Are they animals? Are they a legal category we have not invented yet? And underneath all of those questions sits the operational one, the one that determines real-world outcomes. Who gets to decide? The UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted December 10, 1948, opens with the phrase, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." If Neanderthals are classified as a separate species within the genus Homo, does the word human in that sentence include them? The drafters never considered the question. When Eleanor Roosevelt's committee finalized the wording, exactly one species of human existed on Earth. Every legal, political, and moral architecture we have constructed assumes a world containing one type of person. That assumption has never been tested because biology removed the only possible test case 40,000 years before anyone started writing constitutions. There is a cognitive dimension that makes this even more complicated. The Mousterian tool tradition associated with Neanderthals remained remarkably stable across more than 200,000 years. The same core technique, the Levallois prepared core method, producing the same general categories of stone tool, refined at the margins but never radically reinvented, handed down through roughly 10,000 generations. Set that against the archaeological record of Homo sapiens after about 50,000 years ago, when novel tool forms, entirely new materials, and increasingly elaborate techniques appeared in what looks, from a distance, like an almost compulsive explosion of innovation. Blade technologies, bone awls, eyed needles for sewing-fitted clothing, atlatls for launching projectiles, barbed harpoons, figurative carvings, cave paintings, shell beads, flutes carved from vulture bones. A creative and technological eruption that has continued accelerating without interruption from the Upper Paleolithic to the device you are reading this on right now. Some researchers interpret Neanderthal technological conservatism as evidence of cognitive limitation. João Zilhão, an archaeologist at the University of Barcelona who has studied Neanderthal material culture for decades, argues something different. Neanderthals were conservative innovators. They identified effective solutions and refined them across generations within a stable framework. They did not discard what worked in order to chase what might work better. In a slowly changing or stable environment, that strategy is not inferior. It is arguably superior in terms of energy expenditure and risk management. When your toolkit works and your environment rewards consistency, innovation for its own sake is a cost, not a benefit. The strategy only becomes a liability when the environment shifts faster than your methods can adapt, or when the species competing with you generates novel solutions at a speed and scale you cannot match. If a Neanderthal population existed today, their cognitive style might look less like deficit and more like a temperament we already recognize and sometimes celebrate in our own species. Master woodworkers who spend decades perfecting a single joint, engineers who optimize a proven bridge design rather than replacing it with an untested one, cultures that transmit knowledge through apprenticeship and value depth of skill over breadth of experimentation. We build documentaries about those qualities in humans. We call them mastery. We call them wisdom. In a Neanderthal population already burdened by 300,000 years of being called primitive, we would almost certainly find a different word. Something clinical, something that conveniently justified whatever we had already decided to do with them. The ecological picture adds a layer that almost nobody considers when they run this thought experiment. Hervé Bocquerens and colleagues published isotopic analyses of Neanderthal bones in 2001. Nitrogen-15 ratios in Neanderthal collagen placed them at the absolute top of the food chain, comparable to wolves and cave hyenas. They were apex carnivores. Their diet consisted almost entirely of large herbivores: mammoth, bison, aurochs, red deer, wild horse. They acquired this meat through cooperative close-range hunting, driving sharpened stone into animals that outweighed them by a factor of 5 or 10, at distances where a single kick or a swing of a tusk could end a life. The caloric demands of Neanderthal bodies, stocky and heavily muscled, adapted to conserve heat in glacial environments, were enormous. Estimates based on body mass and climate modeling suggest a Neanderthal male may have required between 3,500 and 5,000 calories per day. That is roughly double what a sedentary modern human needs, every day, in an ice age. Through a winter when large prey herds migrated south and the landscape was locked under snow for months, feeding a Neanderthal community was a logistical and physical achievement that most modern survival experts would struggle to replicate with modern equipment, much less with handmade stone tools and no clothing beyond animal hides. Now imagine a surviving population of those bodies in the modern world. Think about what practical coexistence would actually require. Neanderthals evolved to process massive quantities of animal protein and fat. Their thermoregulatory systems were calibrated for subarctic conditions. Their social structures, based on what we can reconstruct from site sizes and hearth configurations, were small, Probably bands of 15 to 25 individuals who knew each other intimately and cooperated on tasks that required absolute trust, like getting close enough to a bison to stab it by hand. Everything about their evolutionary heritage, their metabolic needs, their social preferences, their sensory wiring was built for a world that no longer exists. But the idea that they would stand mute and uncomprehending while you decided their fate is not supported by the anatomy of their own skulls. Neanderthals did not go extinct because they were lesser. The current evidence from population genetics and site density analysis suggests their total number across all of Europe and Western Asia may never have exceeded tens of thousands at any given moment. Homo sapiens, migrating northward out of Africa in successive waves over tens of thousands of years, arrived with larger social networks, broader resource bases, higher birth rates, and a demographic weight that no amount of individual strength, visual acuity, or cold weather adaptation could counterbalance. Neanderthals were not outthought. They were outnumbered, edged out of productive territories by arithmetic, and gradually absorbed through interbreeding into the genome of the species that had surrounded them, until the last distinct population blinked out somewhere on the southern edge of Europe and left nothing behind but fossils, stone flakes, and a few % of your DNA. If a Neanderthal were standing in front of you right now, you would notice the brow ridge first, the broad nose adapted for warming frigid air before it reached the lungs, the stocky, densely muscled frame engineered by 300,000 years of glacial survival, the face that looks almost exactly like yours and yet, somehow, at some level your brain processes before language can intervene, does not, and everything that happened after that moment of recognition, every snap judgment, every assumption, every legal and social and moral framework you reached for to decide what this person in front of you was and what they deserved would reveal far more about your species than about theirs. The question this thought experiment is actually asking is not what Neanderthals would be if they had survived into our world. The question is what we would become. Whether the species that wrote universal declarations and carved the words all human beings into international law could live by those words when the test finally arrived in a body that did not look like the committee who drafted them. And the fact that you cannot answer that cleanly, the fact that an honest response demands a long, unblinking look at the full record of the only species of humans still here to give one, is the part worth carrying with you after this is over. Thank you for watching until the end. If this changed how you see something, check out the videos on screen. I think they will hit the same way. And subscribe if you haven't. See you in the next one.